So, Daniel, why did God permit slavery in the Bible? And specifically, why would God free Israel from slavery and then allow them to have slaves?
So there's two types of slavery that we're talking about. A is indentured servitude, where there was no credit system back then. There was no bank you could go to and get a loan. So if you were poor or whatever it was and you were starving, you didn't have just a charity. Those are set up by Christians, mind you, and hospitals were made by Christians. You didn't have any of those things to go to for help. What was commonplace in ancient society is that you would indebt yourself to as a slave or an indentured servant to someone that would house you, feed you, and take care of you. And what you'll notice in the Old Testament is there are a ton of laws regulating. There's Jubilee, where they had to get set free on the seventh year. And there are a ton of laws about that, et cetera. I think that most people agree, and this is important to say, I don't think that that's what so a lot of slavery you read about in the Bible is that. However, I think what most atheists are talking about when they talk about slavery is not the fellow Israelites. They're talking about the ones the verses in Leviticus that say, you may buy slaves from neighboring countries. And they didn't, to be fair, they didn't have the same regulations of them that the Israelites did. Right. So there's a couple things with that. So number one, typically in the ancient world, notice the verse says, the foreigners amongst you. Well, ask yourself, why would there be foreigners amongst them? And historically, the reality is a lot of the reason was because of failed wars by neighboring warring tribes or countries. So if there was a foreigner amongst Israel, almost very likely chance that they were a captive from a war. And in the ancient world, you had one of two choices. You could either be put to death or you could become a slave. And that's not obviously ideal, but again, we've talked about progressive revelation and how God worked throughout societies throughout time as well.
You're right. It was incredibly humane for the time.
Well, they would look at like some of the, if you beat him to the inch of his life, but there's even contextual stuff with that where it's like, or the married thing and stuff like that, where it's like, you got to read between the lines of what the customs were and what would actually have been happening at the time too.
Right. So my kind of key takeaways for that was we're dealing with a different situation when we talk about slavery in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as far as the Old Testament, as Daniel said, in most cases it was done to pay off a debt. And we even have examples of slaves wishing to stay with their masters. I remember there was a specific verse that talks about an awl being put through their ear, like a piercing being put through their ear to say,
I love my master.
To say they loved their master. So guys, if it was I guess my point here is that it's very different from the transatlantic slave trade. Otherwise, why would these slaves say, no, I want to stay with my master?
They would argue that was like coerced and stuff like that. That would require a whole video, but it was that whole thing is to make sure that a husband and a wife can stay together, though, I think, and a family can stay together.
Yeah.
Let me just say this to anyone that says the Bible condones slavery. Let me like in the sense that we think about it today. Let me ask you a question. If the Bible condones slavery, why on earth did slaveholders in the 17 and 1800s rip apart the Bible, create what they called the slave Bible, and then feed the slaves the slave Bible?
Right.
Why not just give them a book that condones slavery? What's the purpose in giving them a quote-unquote slave Bible? By your standard, it's already a slave Bible.
Yeah.
So I would,
but yeah, and just finally, I want to say about the Old Testament, it was more humane. And this goes back to progressive revelation. It was more humane than pretty much all of the other countries around it. It was the idea of God giving them regulations around owning slaves. The ancient world was barbaric. There was no rules around having a slave.
Yeah, when we say more humane, it was definitely still not ideal.
It was still rough.
It's still rough. Yes,
God had not revealed his perfect plan for humanity yet that came in the form of Jesus.
And I think what this question really comes down to is theodicy and the problem of evil. You're really just asking at core what all these questions are is why would God allow anything bad to happen ever? Why wouldn't he just come out on day one with the instruction manual and say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And again, the answer is he worked throughout progressive revelation.
Yeah. And also,
you can not like that answer, but that's what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
But lastly, also, man stealing. Look up Exodus. I believe it's Exodus 21. You know what the penalty? You want to talk about how barbaric and condoning the Old Testament is when it comes to slavery? Look up. I forget. I should have known the verse, but in Exodus, you know what the penalty is in the Old Testament for capturing a man and forcing him and selling him? It's death. So according to the Old Testament, the transatlantic slave traders deserve to be put to death by the law of God.
That's good.
So you can't say that it was condoning it when there was a law set up to, if you capture someone forcibly against their will and then sell them, that somehow you are, Anyway, it was the death penalty.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong on this. Coming into the New Testament, I wrote the quote, slavery we see in the New Testament is never a person owning another person outright. That came about during the Atlantic slave trade. So what we see in the New Testament that Paul is referring to when he says, slaves, be obedient to your masters, that was indentured servitude. It was voluntary slavery.
For the most part, there were certainly, we want to be, not always. So there were some times where a lot of the slaves would be countries that Rome had conquered, and that they became slaves as well. So not always. But even that word slave in Hebrew and the word in Greek, there's a reason why James says, he starts his letter, James, a slave of Jesus Christ, because it could mean a servant and stuff like that. So a lot of times it wasn't indentured servitude. That's not to say that it wasn't rough, because via Roman law, your slave was your property. So it wasn't ideal again. But again, I think Got Questions gave a great response to this. What the Bible teaches us is that God, throughout history, has not been primarily concerned with social change. He's concerned with changing the human heart through His Spirit.
That's good.